Hello, and welcome to the Morris-Jumel Mansion. My name is Megan Burns, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the museum. This is an exciting time as we embark on a new period of reinterpretation and research to share the stories of people commonly left out of the historical narrative, including women, African Americans, and Native peoples. Thanks to a project funded by Humanities New York, we are able to continue our work with select community scholars and historians to highlight the stories of Black individuals connected with the historic site, including people who were enslaved and free. This project is essential for Morris-Jumel Mansion to continue its work to help make history relevant for our audiences and to empower our community to see themselves reflected in the museum's spaces and its storytelling. The video you are about to see features a presentation about a man named William Lee by Associate Curator Jessie Macleod from George Washington's Mount Vernon. William Lee was Washington's enslaved valet during the American Revolution and was believed to have been at the mansion in the fall of 1776 when Washington used this house as his military headquarters. Lee was known as an incredible horseman and was the only enslaved person freed by Washington upon the president's death in 1799. What might his perspective have been on the war for independence when he himself was held in bondage? Jessie Macleod tells us more about his life and legacy.
So in the 1790s, veteran Revolutionary War officers who visited Mount Vernon frequently stopped to pay their respects to an old acquaintance. The man had served with the American cause throughout the entire war, from the Siege of Boston to the Battle of Yorktown. And like the visitors, he had endured the ecstasies of victory and the agonies of defeat as the Continental Army clashed with the mighty British forces. He reminisced with these visitors about the old days, recalling, "Was it not cold enough at Valley Forge? Yes. And I'm sure you remember it was hot enough at Monmouth." Yet this man was not an officer, nor even a soldier. He was George Washington's enslaved body servant, William Lee. William Lee served as George Washington's personal attendant throughout the entire Revolution, from when Washington left Mount Vernon for Cambridge, Massachusetts in June of 1775, to the moment he returned home on December 23, 1783, having resigned his commission in the Army. William Lee's association with George Washington made him a famous figure in his own right. In John Trumbull's 1780 portrait of Washington, the man in the background likely represents Lee, although the dark-skinned figure wearing a turban says more about the artistic convention of the exoticized servant than it does Lee's actual physical appearance. Still, this depiction is fitting because Lee's story has often been relegated to the background of Washington's narrative. Historians mention him as a faithful wartime servant whom Washington ultimately rewarded with his freedom. But today, I want to take William Lee out of the background and examine the complexities of his lived experience. It's true that much of what we know about his life derives from his relationship with Washington, because Lee didn't leave any records of his own, like most enslaved people. But we can also use different modes of inquiry to consider his daily life, his relationships, his motivations, as a fully rendered person in his own right. So this entry from George Washington's ledger lists the names of 4 enslaved people he bought from Mary Lee, who was a widow in Westmoreland County, Virginia. And the transaction occurred in 1768. Washington paid 61 pounds 15 shillings for William Lee and 50 pounds for Lee's younger brother, Frank, as well as 19 pounds each for 2 boys named Adam and Jack. William and Frank were probably in their late teens or early 20s at this time, and Washington on this document describes them both as mulatto, meaning mixed race. Given that both brothers later used the surname Lee, it's possible that their father was a white member of the Lee family, or they may have used the name simply because of their association with the Lee family. At Mount Vernon, both William and Frank Lee were assigned to work in the house. Frank ultimately became the butler, which was a critical role that involved overseeing the dining room and vetting Mount Vernon's many visitors. William Lee, of course, became Washington's personal manservant. As manservant, or valet, to use the English pronunciation, Lee was tasked with managing the logistics of Washington's appearance, his personal effects, and his daily life. In her 1861 guidebook to household management, English writer Isabella Beeton noted, "The valet and waiting maid are placed near the persons of the master and mistress, receiving orders only from them, dressing them, accompanying them in all their journeys, the confidants and agents of their most unguarded moments, of their most secret habits, and of course, subject to their commands." William Lee doesn't appear in this 1776 portrait of Washington by Charles Willson Peale, but his handiwork does. Lee was responsible for airing out and brushing Washington's uniform, polishing his boots, fetching water so he could wash his face and hands, arranging his toiletries, and pulling his hair back into its trademark queue or ponytail. By necessity, Lee was skilled in areas that Washington valued. Described as muscular and athletic, he was a talented horseman. Before the war, Lee accompanied Washington on fox hunts, and during the Revolution, he was a constant presence on horseback behind the general. Surviving military objects in Mount Vernon's collection tell the story of William Lee as much as George Washington himself. Washington likely purchased this traveling razor case for use during the war. It included a razor, a hone and strap to polish and sharpen the blade, a lather brush, a comb, and a small mirror. It would have been William Lee's responsibility to lay out its contents for the general and clean each item when he had finished shaving. Lee would have been intimately familiar with the contents of these leather canteens, which were used to hold bottles of liquor, condiments, and other supplies that Washington used to entertain at camp and headquarters. Although Mount Vernon had a staff of enslaved waiters, one of Lee's wartime responsibilities was serving Washington and his officers and guests during meals. Lee was also charged with managing the storage and security of Washington's wartime correspondence. Washington purchased this hair trunk in April of 1776, shortly before departing Boston for New York City. This may have been the trunk where his papers were stored during his residence at the Morris Mansion in the fall of that year. Given the sensitive nature of Washington's letters, placing them in Lee's care suggests the deep trust the general had in his body servant. Although Lee had important responsibilities during the war, there was no mistaking his status. At Mount Vernon, the enslaved men stationed in the household wore wool livery suits of white and red, the colors of the Washington family coat of arms. During the war, Washington purchased fabric to make Lee additional coats, waistcoats, and breeches in this manner. Wearing livery immediately identified Lee as Washington's property, exhibiting his master's wealth both in the textiles he wore and in his body itself. During the 5 weeks that Washington used the Morris Mansion as his headquarters in the fall of 1776, William Lee was there too. While few records from that time specifically mention Lee, he would have been in the house, and we can surmise what he experienced while he was there. Lee probably unpacked Washington's belongings as they set up the new headquarters, knowing that they might have to be gathered at any moment should the army need to retreat in haste. Lee likely stood on the outskirts of the war room or just outside in the hall as Washington conferred with his officers, perhaps fetching them glasses of wine or delivering messages. Here, in the room where it happened, he would have been privy to confidential and highly sensitive information, as Washington determined what his strategy would be moving forward. At the headquarters, Lee was just one of a host of enslaved and hired laborers who ensured that the basic needs of Washington and his officers were met. A white steward and housekeeper ensured that the household was stocked with food and drink, that clothing and table linens were washed and mended, and took care of countless other logistical arrangements so that Washington and his staff could focus on their wartime activities. Numerous receipts in Washington's Revolutionary War papers show payments for these services and the names of the local people who rendered them. For example, this receipt shows a payment to a Mrs. Marshall for washing Washington's clothing and table linens, as well as washing and mending for servants, which may have included William Lee. It's signed by Andrew Marshall, her husband, likely because Mrs. Marshall was not literate. Feeding the household of Washington's many officers and aides was no small task. This receipt shows a purchase of 160 cabbages and red beets, 12 bunches of carrots, 3 bunches of turnips, as well as parsley, thyme, and onions. Other receipts show purchases of 211 pounds of pickled hams, 74 loaves of bread, and 163 bottles of Madeira wine, which was one of Washington's preferred beverages. One of these receipts may be of particular interest because it shows a payment to a woman named Martha Morris, described as a Negro wench, for washing clothes for the household. Dated October 19, 1776, this payment was made just before Washington and his staff left the Morris house. From the document, it's unclear whether Martha was enslaved or free, but the last name Morris suggests some connection to the family who had abandoned the property. And so this is an intriguing avenue for future research. At the Morris Mansion, William Lee may have slept on a pallet in the hallway outside Washington's bedchamber, or perhaps in a small room nearby. He was used to makeshift accommodations. When the army was in camp, he slept on the ground in the baggage compartment of Washington's headquarters tent, just outside Washington's own sleeping quarters. And these images show a reproduction of the tent and that space where William Lee may have stayed. In his memoirs, Washington's step-grandson hints at William Lee's temporary sleeping arrangements during the war. During the memorable campaigns of 1777 and 78, he wrote, "The habit at the headquarters was for the general to dismiss his officers at a very late hour of the night to snatch a little repose, while Washington, the man of mighty labors, drawing his cloak around him and trimming his lamp, would throw himself upon a hard couch, not to sleep, but to think. Close to his master, wrapped in a blanket, but all accoutered for instant service, snored the stout yet active form of Billy, the celebrated body servant during the whole of the Revolutionary War. Indeed, as an attendant, Lee was always on call, required to respond to Washington's summons at a moment's notice." Another factor shaping William Lee's experience at the Morris Mansion was Washington's state of mind. The general managed to stay even-keeled most of the time, but a fierce temper lurked beneath his measured exterior. Thomas Jefferson once wrote, "His temper was naturally irritable and high-toned, but reflection and resolution had obtained a firm and habitual ascendancy over it. If, however, it broke its bonds, he was most tremendous in his wrath." On September 14, 1776, Washington had been incensed when inexperienced militia retreated in chaos upon the British landing at Kips Bay. The general rode his horse among the fleeing soldiers, cursing and even striking some with the flat of his sword. It was here that Washington famously threw his hat to the ground and lamented, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" Though American troops successfully held their position at the Battle of Harlem Heights the next day, Washington remained deeply concerned about his ability to hold off the British with the men under his command. On September 20th, while stationed at the Morris Mansion, Washington wrote to John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, noting that the enlistments of most of the current troops were coming to an end, leaving the Continental Army severely incapacitated. One can almost hear Washington gritting his teeth as he writes, "I take the liberty of suggesting to Congress not only the expediency, but the absolute necessity there is that their earliest attention should be had to this subject." 10 days later, Washington was more frank in a letter to his Mount Vernon plantation manager. In short, he wrote, "Such is my situation that if I were to wish the bitterest curse to an enemy on this side of the grave, I should put them in my stead, with my feelings, and yet I do not know what plan of conduct to pursue. He continued, in confidence, I tell you that I never was in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born. Clearly, Washington was battling more than the British during these weeks. So what effect did this have on William Lee? Accounts suggest that Washington's rage could bubble over more easily toward the people he enslaved, perhaps as a release valve, as Washington remained disciplined among his social equals. Richard Parkinson, an English visitor to Mount Vernon in 1798, observed, "The first time I walked with General Washington among his Negroes, when he spoke to them, he amazed me by the utterance of his words. He spoke as differently as if he had been quite another man or had been in anger." Similarly, in recalling Washington's daily routine, his nephew Lawrence Lewis noted, "His habits were regular. He arose before or at the dawn of day and lighted his own candle and went into his study. When daylight became sufficient to extinguish his candle, he rang the bell and a servant appeared with his boots. He said not a word, but would turn them round and round. If clean, they were quietly drawn on. If not, the servant got them about his head, but without the general betraying any excitement beyond the effort of the moment. In a minute afterwards, he was no less calm and collected than usual." Did William Lee bear the brunt of Washington's frustration? Washington was a demanding and exacting master in the best of times. One can imagine that he was particularly challenging to work for during these stressful weeks when he feared that his cause was lost. During this time, William Lee was also navigating a landscape that presented something he may have never experienced before: options. As the Revolutionary War disrupted the social fabric of the colonies, many enslaved people seized the opportunity to change their circumstances. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had begun offering freedom to slaves of patriots who fled to fight for the crown. Over the course of the war, tens of thousands of enslaved people sought refuge with the British, including at least 17 from Mount Vernon. Near the front lines throughout the war, William Lee had ample opportunity to escape, should he have chosen to, but he didn't. Washington attributed Lee's steadfastness to loyalty, but we can consider many reasons why Lee might have chosen to stay. Perhaps he didn't think that running was worth the risk. Indeed, seeking freedom was dangerous under any circumstances, but it was especially so during wartime. Thousands of enslaved people who fled died from smallpox outbreaks that ravaged the British Army. Others succumbed to starvation, exposure, and combat injuries, or were recaptured by their enslavers at the end of the war, and that included 8 of those who escaped from Mount Vernon. In addition, Lee knew that his association with Washington made him highly recognizable, complicating any efforts to blend in or change his identity in order to avoid detection. It's also possible that Lee was playing the long game. From his close contact with Washington, he may have had an inkling that the general's views on slavery were changing. The Revolutionary War was a crucial turning point for Washington, who inherited his first slaves at age 11 and began his adult life as a typical Virginia tobacco planter. By the 1760s, Washington had become disillusioned with the economic inefficiencies of the slave labor system. And during the war, he began to question its morality as well. Washington's close relationships with abolitionists like Alexander Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette, and John Laurens likely pushed him to consider a principled stance against slavery, which culminated in his decision to place an emancipation provision in his will. William Lee may have anticipated Washington's change of heart, or at the least, hoped that his service might be rewarded with his own emancipation. And even if that moment was a long way in the future, cultivating Washington's goodwill could pay off for Lee in other ways, as we see in an incident after the war. One of the laborers whom Lee had occasion to interact with at headquarters was Margaret Thomas, a free Black woman who was hired to do laundry for Washington's household. Thomas first appears in Washington's accounts in February of 1776, when she was paid for making 3 shirts for William. And you can see that in the second line of this account on the screen. It's unclear whether this is how Lee and Thomas met, or if they were already acquainted and perhaps Lee convinced Washington's steward to hire her. Either way, Thomas remained with Washington's military household throughout the war, and at some point, she and William Lee married. We know about their marriage because on July 28, 1784, 7 months after returning home, Washington wrote to his agent in Philadelphia that William Lee had asked him to bring Thomas to Mount Vernon. Washington grumbled that he never wished to see her more, yet I cannot refuse his request if it can be complied with on reasonable terms, as he has lived with me for so long and followed my fortunes through the war with fidelity. Washington asked his agent to secure Margaret Thomas passage to Virginia, but unfortunately we don't know if Thomas ever arrived. There are no records of her at Mount Vernon in the 1780s or 90s, and William Lee is listed without a wife on Washington's 1799 census of the enslaved population. In his letter, Washington had noted that Thomas had been in an infirm state of health for some time, and so it's possible that she either died before traveling to Mount Vernon or shortly after arriving. But whether or not she actually came to Mount Vernon, this poignant story reveals how William Lee was able to leverage Washington's goodwill in order to attempt a reunion with his family. Back at Mount Vernon, Lee resumed his duties as Washington's manservant, but a series of misfortunes would soon change the course of his life. On April 22, 1785, Lee was carrying a chain for Washington as he surveyed a portion of a neighbor's plantation, when he fell and broke his kneecap. Washington noted in his diary that he was obliged to get a sled to carry Will on, as he could neither walk, stand, or ride. 2.5 years later, Lee suffered another accident. Washington recorded in his diary again, "Having sent my waiter Will to Alexandria to the post office, he fell and broke the pan of his other knee and was not able to return." Breaking both of his kneecaps severely impaired his mobility, but despite these injuries, Lee did leave Mount Vernon in early April 1789, joining Washington's Secretary Tobias Lear to travel to New York for the first presidential inauguration. The journey proved too strenuous, however, and Lee was forced to stay behind in Philadelphia to seek medical help under the care of Washington's agent, Clement Biddle. When his condition had not improved 3 weeks later, Washington suggested that Lee might return to Mount Vernon, given that, quote, "he cannot possibly be of any service here, and perhaps will require a person to attend upon him constantly." Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear, wrote to Biddle, "But if he is still anxious to come on here, the president would gratify him, although he will be troublesome. He has been an old and faithful servant. This is enough for the president to gratify him in every reasonable wish." Lee insisted on continuing to New York, and after being outfitted with a steel brace that enabled him to walk, he arrived in the city on June 15, 1789. This is another situation where we can consider Lee's motivations. Why was he so eager to continue to New York? Was it loyalty, as Washington believed? Perhaps. But there may be other reasons he was desperate to retain his position. Lee was surely evaluating what his fate would be if he returned to Virginia in his disabled state. There, he would be under the supervision of the plantation's managers and overseers, with whom he did not have the close relationship in history he enjoyed with George Washington. Perhaps more importantly, enslaved people with disabilities were often assigned to menial tasks, received fewer rations and worse quality clothing than their able-bodied counterparts. In a 1795 letter to his plantation manager about clothing distribution, George Washington directed that the better sort of linen be given to the grown people and the most deserving, while the more indifferent sort is served to the younger ones and the worthless. While no assignment within slavery can be deemed desirable, personal attendants and others in household roles did benefit from certain physical comforts, as well as status in the eyes of white observers. We don't know to what extent Lee was able to perform his duties as Washington's valet in New York, but he remained in the city for over a year. It seems that Washington was not satisfied, however, and in late July 1790, he sent Lee back to Virginia after all. This means that Lee was probably still in New York City when Washington hosted his cabinet dinner at his former headquarters on July 10th, 1790. But given his disability, it's unlikely that he would have accompanied the party from the executive residence. However, his replacement may have. Washington began employing William Osborne, a hired white servant, as his valet in early July, probably because he knew that Lee was about to be sent back to Virginia. Osborne joined a household that consisted of a mix of hired and enslaved servants. In addition to Lee, the Washingtons had taken 6 other enslaved people from Mount Vernon to New York for the presidency. They were lady's maid Ona Judge, Lee's counterpart for Martha Washington, waiters Christopher Shields in Austin, coachman Giles in Paris, and Molly, a nursemaid for Martha Washington's 2 young grandchildren who lived with the couple during the presidency. The experiences of 2 of the individuals mentioned here can help us understand the complexity of William Lee's situation. When George Washington retired from the presidency, he assigned 21-year-old Christopher Shields to be his attendant, replacing the succession of hired white servants he had used during his 2 terms. In 1799, Shields made plans to flee Mount Vernon with his wife, who lived on a neighboring plantation. Unfortunately, a note detailing their plan was discovered, and so the couple's escape was foiled. Ona Judge, Martha Washington's lady's maid, also made plans to escape, but unlike Shields, she was successful. In May of 1796, 24-year-old Judge fled from the executive residence in Philadelphia when she learned that Martha planned to give her as a wedding present to her granddaughter. With the help of friends in Philadelphia's free Black community, she secured passage on a ship to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Washingtons were furious, especially Martha, who felt attached to the young woman who had served as her maid for the previous 12 years, claiming that she had been treated more as a child than a servant. The Washingtons launched a coordinated campaign to recapture Judge from New Hampshire, sending agents to search for her and bring her back. In dramatic fashion, Judge evaded their efforts, going into hiding until after Washington died. As an elderly woman in the 1840s, Judge described her reason for running away to a newspaper reporter. It was simply, she said, that she wanted to be free. The experiences of Christopher Shields and Ona Judge suggest that while serving as a personal attendant may have come with certain perks, it certainly did not make the experience of slavery any more tolerable. And indeed, certain aspects of the position, such as near constant surveillance by the enslaver, the lack of privacy, the long and variable hours of service, might have made it even less appealing than other posts. The lives of Lee, Shields, and Judge speak to the tension inherent in the role of enslaved body servant. Given the intimate nature of their work, enslavers needed to feel that they could trust their attendants. Yet in a relationship governed by coercion rather than choice, true trust was almost impossible to achieve. When William Lee arrived back at Mount Vernon, he was assigned to be the plantation's shoemaker, likely because it was a job that he could perform sitting down. Over the next decade, Lee made hundreds of pairs of shoes for Mount Vernon's enslaved and hired laborers, based out of a shop in the back of the greenhouse. This plantation account book notes the many pieces of leather that were distributed to Lee on the left side and the footwear he produced for men and women across the plantation on the right. Lee's experience as shoemaker was surely a vast departure from his previous assignment, although it made him no less indispensable to Mount Vernon's operation. On December 13, 1799, George Washington fell ill with a throat infection after riding across his plantation in cold, wet weather. Despite the efforts of numerous physicians who attempted bloodletting and other cures, Washington died the next day at age 67. On his deathbed, Washington had instructed his wife to take 2 versions of his will from his desk and burn one of them. When the contents of their surviving will were revealed, word of what it said spread quickly. Washington ordered that, quote, "Upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom." There was one exception. On page 4, Washington declared, "And to my mulatto man, William, calling himself William Lee, I give immediate freedom." He also directed that Lee receive an annual pension of $30 and be permitted to continue living at Mount Vernon. He noted, "This I give him as a testimony of my sense of his attachment to me and for his faithful services during the Revolutionary War." The accounts of Washington's executors show that they carried out Washington's wishes, providing Lee's annuity with money from the late president's estate. Here is one notation from September 1800, which shows that Washington's nephew paid William Shoemaker as directed by the will of General Washington. Although William Lee was finally free, his old injuries continued to haunt him. In 1804, the artist Charles Willson Peale visited with Lee at Mount Vernon and noted, "He was now a cripple, and in an extraordinary manner. Both of his knee pans were moved from their places some inches higher up his leg." According to Martha Washington's grandson, Lee turned to alcohol in the ensuing years, perhaps to numb the excruciating pain caused by his dislocated knees. Sources differ as to the exact date, but sometime between 1810 and 1828, William Lee died at Mount Vernon. He's buried in the enslaved community cemetery, which is located on a quiet wooded ridge overlooking the Potomac River. Over the last 5 years, Mount Vernon archaeologists have been conducting a survey of this site, mapping the location and orientation of grave shafts without disturbing any human remains. The graves were originally marked with earthen mounds, but unfortunately, due to erosion, these are no longer visible. We have no way to know which grave belongs to Lee, but we hope that learning more about his final resting place will help us paint a more detailed picture of his life. Finally, I want to conclude by discussing some of the strategies that we've used at Mount Vernon to interpret William Lee's experiences for our visitors, which are also strategies that I've used as I've talked to you all here today. So as you all know, because we rarely have documents from the perspective of enslaved people, we do have to be creative in how we approach the topic. So this image shows one gallery from our Lives Bound Together exhibit, where we've placed a conjectural silhouette of Lee, which you saw on an earlier slide, in conversation with a graphic of the John Trumbull portrait that I mentioned earlier. And this silhouette is just one of 18 life-size silhouettes that we commissioned for the exhibit from an illustrator. And we use them as a way to humanize the story of slavery. So each of these silhouettes is paired with an interactive touchscreen that allows visitors to learn more about that person's life. And we've found that placing these individuals back on the landscape through this physical representation really grabs visitors' attention, and it helps drive home the fact that these people were as real as George or Martha Washington, whose images people already have in their minds. In the exhibit, we've also reinterpreted objects in our collection to discuss how they relate to slavery. So for William Lee, we show Washington's spyglass and his silver camp cups and discuss Lee's constant presence at headquarters and in camp, and how he would have been interacting with these objects, touching them, cleaning them, using them as much, if not more often, than Washington himself. And you can do this with any kind of decorative arts object that were in a household where enslaved people worked. So the Washington's porcelain dinner service provides a vehicle to discuss the enslaved cooks who were preparing the food and the enslaved waiters who were serving it. Martha Washington's jewelry allows us to mention Ona Judge and her role in maintaining Martha's appearance. And so even without objects from enslaved people themselves, which we're fortunate to have in some cases through archaeology, we can reframe these objects in our collection to make them artifacts of slavery, because they really were. Everything from the 18th century is really an artifact of slavery in some way. And then finally, the two other strategies that I want to mention involves how we think about historical evidence as we're crafting a narrative. So in the past, many sites, including Mount Vernon, have used a lack of documentation as an excuse to not mention slavery or enslaved people. And that's especially egregious at Mount Vernon because we actually have a huge amount of documentation, much more than many sites. But that's been a frequent refrain. You know, we just don't have the information, we just don't know. But a lack of documentation doesn't mean that enslaved people weren't there. It doesn't mean that they weren't important. And by continuing that silence, we're not providing an accurate historical narrative to our visitors and our audiences. And so one way to bring the stories of enslaved people to the fore is through something called informed conjecture. And this is a process by which we make reasonable assumptions based on context and other documented information. So for example, we don't have a specific source stating that William Lee cleaned Washington's razor or polished his boots, but we know that those tasks were part of a manservant's duties, and so we can reasonably state that he would have done them. And this applies to all sorts of situations. And then finally, one of the most effective tools to use in the face of uncertainty and lack of specific documentation is just to ask questions. So most of the time we don't have William Lee's perspective, but we can ask ourselves, as I've tried to do today, how he might have felt, what might have been going through his mind given his circumstances at these various points in time. And so I think asking visitors open-ended questions can encourage empathy towards these marginalized individuals and really drive home that they were complex people. They had their own joys and sorrows and choices and agency, and their lives are worthy of as much detailed study as people like the Washingtons.